Welcome to the Illuminating Primary Care podcast.
Hello and welcome to today's episode of Illuminating Primary Care with Menlo Park Recruitment. My guest today is Dr. Sally Hambly, who's got very much a passion of supporting doctors to make life and career choices which put their well-being at the centre. Thank you for joining me today, Sally. If you could give our listeners a little bit of an understanding as to who you are and what it is you do, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I worked myself as a doctor in the NHS for 24 years. Didn't really follow a traditional route through medicine, so I did a lot of junior doctor jobs back in the day when you could make it up a bit more as you went along. We had a bit more freedom because I didn't really know what I wanted to do, to be honest with you.
Okay.
And then I went down the training route of general practice, but also developed a sideline interest in, well, I say sexual health, it was called GU medicine back then. And then did run those two alongside one another probably for about 3 years. But then when I came back from my first maternity leave, I chose to carry on in the GU medicine because I was loving that job at the time. And then did that for probably about a decade, switched over to medicine for the elderly because I had a little bit of a midlife career crisis. Just never quite settled there. So heard about coaching, and a friend of mine had gone along to a foundational coaching course, and it just sounded so intriguing. I was just riveted by what she was saying. So I thought, well, I'll go and get myself some of that because I wasn't really quite sure I was at where I wanted to be. And that was fantastically helpful. And I think there were two upshots from that. One was that I tweaked the role I was in at the time, which definitely suited me better, but also started training to be a coach myself. And I've now since left clinical medicine for the moment, at least. And I work predominantly with medics who just don't quite know what they want to do with their career, because I can relate to that. I had a lot of those feelings throughout my medical career of not quite sure where to go. So that's where I'm at now.
Fantastic. And you've been doing the coaching. I mean, you're available online, aren't you? You're contactable on LinkedIn, but do you have a website or anything like that as well that people are able to utilize?
Yeah, my website is being updated and sorted at the moment, but it's should be about in the next week or two. I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, as you might have noticed. So that's predominantly where I've been, and predominantly where I've made my connections and networked and met lots of people through LinkedIn. So having been a social media avoider all of my life, I'm a little bit of a convert.
Yes, LinkedIn works slightly differently, at least, doesn't it?
It does.
Ads with merchandise that's suitable for you and things like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, before we started recording the podcast, just for our listeners' benefit, Sally and I had liaised about some points that we thought would be really beneficial for our listeners to learn more about. Now, the first of these, and this is what we're wanting Sally to be able to give us a bit of a deep dive into, is factors for doctors about things like recognizing and acknowledging that so many doctors are unhappy in their careers currently, and to understand that they're not alone in this. So, Sally, if you could kind of develop upon that a little bit further, please, just for our listeners, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, unfortunately, there's been quite a lot of work, quite a lot of surveys done, which, are looking at, well, partly looking at burnout, but also looking at actually the number of doctors wanting to leave the NHS, and it's kind of across the board in terms of, within general practice, but also hospital doctors as well. Certainly, I think the RCGP survey from last year, I think it was about 39% of doctors are anticipating leaving general practice within the next 5 years.
Wow. Does that include retirement?
It's phenomenal. Yeah, it's a combination.
Okay.
But also, I think there was a Pulse survey recently, which again predominantly was looking at actually kind of younger GPs thinking of leaving as well. And I think, there's a whole host of reasons for that. And I mention it really because I think when you're kind of questioning what you want to do in medicine, you can feel quite on your own. It can feel quite a lonely place to be. So I guess I just wanted to, make the point that actually lots of people are feeling in a similar position. So you're definitely not alone if you're questioning your career in medicine, or you're just not sure whether it's sustainable with, sustaining your own well-being. You're not on your own with it. But I think what can come into play, and what I hear from doctors a lot, is essentially this phenomenon called the sunk cost fallacy, which
Sunk
basically,
was that? Sorry.
yeah, sunk cost fallacy. I think that's
Okay.
a term that's used in various different industries actually, but in terms of what it means essentially is when you've invested so much to get to a certain point that actually even when you find yourself in a position whereby you're not really happy or it's not really working for you or you're not sure you're in the right environment, because you've invested so much already, the temptation is just to keep on going, to justify what you've got.
Trudging
Yeah,
through
keep
things.
trudging to justify what you've given. And I think it's certainly very relevant to to medics, because by the time you get to be a GP, you've already invested really heavily to get to that point.
Oh,
So
yeah,
you
time and
know,
energy. I mean,
yeah,
the length of time it takes to get to that
yeah,
point in terms of your qualifications, courses, exams, the
yeah,
stress that comes with that as well. You don't want to,
yeah.
for want of a better expression, throw it all away, do you?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely that. I mean, even going back to just medical school in itself, it's a very demanding degree to do, and like you say, the time and the energy, the finances you invest as well, actually, to get through medical school. But then, yeah, your junior doctor years as a foundation doctor and specialty trainee. I mean, it is all consuming, isn't it? You just give so much of yourself, physically, emotionally, mentally. It can become your world, and so it's quite hard when you get to a point where you think, yeah, I'm not sure this is quite working for me. And I think what can also kick in sometimes then is a bit of kind of either or thinking, so a bit of black and white. Well, either I carry on as things are, or I completely jump ship, both of which or neither of which feels very comfortable. So it's quite
Yeah.
a scary position to find yourself in. And I think the risk is that then you don't get started, you don't start exploring actually what might work for you, because those two options just seem too extreme and uncomfortable.
Okay. And in that regard, do you find that the sunk cost fallacy that you've mentioned, does that tend to come into play in your experience? Have you seen that after a year of working in primary care, or can it come into play a lot further along? Have you, in your experience, has it come about in different people's careers at very different times?
Yeah, I think it can come across at any time in your career, to be honest with you. I think it could even come across, earlier in your career before you've fully qualified or whatever, even when you've invested going through medical school. And I think there can be, that weight of expectation on your shoulders as well, be that your own expectations of yourself, or perhaps sometimes it's that family expectation or, societal expectations. I think there's a lot of that tied up in it. And I think the further you go throughout it, what can happen sometimes is that you lose sight of who you are, and I think your identity becomes kind of enmeshed with your job title, essentially. And again, that's quite difficult, because then when you're not feeling happy in what you're doing, it feels even bigger than just questioning your job. It feels like you're almost questioning who you are.
Yes.
And again, I think that can happen at any stage.
Okay. And is that what you feel leads to more reactive decisions and choices, as opposed to proactive and something that might be healthier for somebody to make as a decision?
Yeah, I think because perhaps we lose sight of ourselves a bit, and this certainly happened to me, and I see it with the people I work with. We can be quite good at thinking, oh, that doesn't work, this doesn't work for me. I'll go ahead and do that, but without actually doing the next bit of work. Well, I think we don't necessarily fully understand the disconnects before we make the decisions. But the other thing we often don't get our head around is actually, what do we want instead of that? Because I think when you start out, often you don't have a clear idea what you want. And again, that feels quite scary and uncertain. So it's quite hard to work towards something when you've got no idea where you're working towards. And that's, I suppose, the basis of, a lot of the work I do is actually working out what that is for somebody, because that will be different for everybody.
Yeah.
But then it allows you to be more proactive in making your decisions, rather than just reactive to, like, I don't like this.
Okay. And have you found that comes about with not only just kind of, let's say, general practice, if you're just running a routine clinic, let's say, but also with things like specialisms? If somebody's thought during the training, given the opportunity, I'd like to go on and become a specialist in this area, or develop my understanding and my ability in this area.
Yeah.
And then after so long of maybe starting that, they think, I'm not really sure if this is going to be right for me.
Yeah.
Do you encourage people to kind of, see it through before making any decision, or do you think it's important to kind of when you get that sense of this isn't going to be right, calling it a day and trying to proactively find something new. How would you kind of guide people from there, do you think, Sally?
Yeah, so sorry, do you mean when they're going through their training, so before they've actually got to the
Yeah.
Again, there's no one size fits all, and so, the coaching that I do is about actually exploring what's right for that individual. So again, it's almost stripping it back to basics, because it's very hard to say this is right or that is right, because again, you're kind of narrowing it down. It's really working out, where are you at now? What's going on for you? And I emphasize where you're at now, because sometimes I think we can still think about what we wanted perhaps, or what we envisaged when we were 17 and we applied to medical school. But actually, what's going on in your life now? What are your priorities now? Where are you at? What's not working? What's working? And again, looking at what you want instead. So it's very individual. So some people might choose to carry on with their training, depending on what has been identified as the primary issue. So I think the issues can be very different, and sometimes there can be an overlap, but sometimes it can be less so around the actual job itself and more so around, the very nature of medical training is there's a lot of self-sacrifice within there. That's actually kind of how the NHS survives, if we're honest, isn't it, in terms of, people giving and giving and giving of themselves. And I think that can then blur into actually, as doctors, we're not necessarily the best at setting clear boundaries, because it's kind of being driven out of us. I also think, we're generally not very good in terms of self-care. And I know you've had people on your show talking about that, so I won't go into that in detail. But, in terms of some of the basic things often get missed in terms of looking after ourselves. So sometimes it can be less about the job and more about the things surrounding the job. Sometimes it is more about the job and just actually the fit isn't right. So, there is no one size fits all. It really depends on the individual and what's coming up.
Yeah, I suppose that in that regard as well, it's not even just for our listeners' benefit, the individual in the sense of what they might want to pursue, or what the practice itself might be like, but where they're at in their lives, whether they're starting a family, or if they've got I've spoken to a GP just recently, for instance, who's had sick family back home, overseas, and that can affect so many things, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and also it's the time that it takes to get to and from. So like you say, it really does come down to the individual. But do you feel that there is kind of a bit of a stereotype as to this is what a GP should do, and this almost, like you say, one size fits all attitude towards it, but in reality that is very far off the mark?
I think one of the issues with medicine still now is that there are very traditional, clear-cut pathways through medicine, and you have to make the occasional choice along the way. Obviously, like, do I go into general practice training or whatever? But it can feel then a bit of a treadmill, and you can feel a little bit blinkered, because you make that decision and then you get on it, and you at some point you kind of get spewed out the end. And I think that is the point at which sometimes people think, hang on a minute, I've just spent however many years getting here, and the truth is it's very difficult to know until you've had a decent exposure to something, whether it is the right thing fit for you or not. So I think, that can happen, that actually sometimes you get to a point you think, I'm actually just not quite in the right place for me. And it's then working out, where is the right place?
Yeah, so it's that self-awareness that I think is very important.
Yeah.
I think going off what you've mentioned as well in terms of how the NHS operates, and not necessarily deliberately in that this is how it's designed to set up, but where it's got to now, it's in such a position whereby it does depend on the goodwill and the the goodness of heart, shall we say, of these individuals who are GPs. Whether it's staying that extra bit late on a Friday to deal with somebody before the weekend comes in, or whatever it may be, it's not something that I think can last forever.
No.
Because as you say, there are really quite startling statistics of GPs rather that are leaving the profession or taking early retirement. I mean, what we found, Sally, I don't know if you found this from people that you've been dealing with yourself on a one-to-one basis, But a lot of people are leaving the NHS to try and find private work, or they're going into locum work because of the flexibility. And that brings us back to people's individual circumstances. There's a chap I've dealt with recently, for instance, who said, I've got my kids on the way, and a second kid on the way, and I want to be paying for a wedding. Locum work, it gives me more flexibility around the children. It pays better. Do you find that sometimes maybe the locum route is better depending on circumstances, or do you think the support of more of let's say a salaried GP position and having that employment of a practice can be better? Or again, is it very much down to the individual and their circumstance?
You knew I was going to say that, didn't you? It is. I think it's so individual because we are all different and we all thrive in different environments and in different ways. So, for example, like you say, if someone values that flexibility and that sense of freedom that you can get with that locum work, and it fits in with the rest of their life at that time, that could work out well for them. But other people, for example, actually could find that quite isolating, and that sense of team or being part of a team is really important to them, in which case a more regular environment may well suit them better. But again, as I say, it is so individual, and it's not until you really explore it with the individual that you start to tease out actually what are the options going forward that are going to work, are going to work well for you. So I think it is really, really variable, but it all comes back to going back to who am I, what is going to work for me in this particular situation, and which options are viable options that are going to be potential routes. Because there's one thing I always emphasize is I think we can also get weighed down by thinking there is one right thing for me to do, and I need to find that one right thing. But actually, when you work out what it is that you are looking for, and when I say what you're looking for, I don't necessarily mean a job title. I mean, what are you looking to get out of your career? How do you want your career to fit into the rest of your life? What drives you and is really important to you? Once you get a bit clearer on that, there are actually different ways that you can get there. And I think that's quite freeing in itself without thinking. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack, oh gosh, there's one right way for me, I've got to find it. Again, I think that can put people off starting. So actually working out where you want to go, there are different ways to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of one of the points that you'd mentioned as well prior to our conversation was looking at stepping up to a new role and what pressures might come with this. And you gave me the example of first fully qualified GP role.
Yeah.
In your experience, do you feel that there is almost this idea around what it should be, but then it can work out very differently? Or do you think that the individuals themselves, these newly qualified GPs might be going into it with slightly the wrong ideas? What's been your experience in the conversations you've had about this sort of stepping up into that new role, Sally?
Yeah, I think it's very variable, and I think it can depend on the practice you find yourself in. So whether it's the right practice for you, whether it's the kind of support that you're looking for, because all practices are very different, aren't they? They run very differently. They can have a different feel, different ethos. Sometimes it's about which is the right type of practice that I'm looking for. But I think regardless, actually, that step up from essentially being a trainee to being fully qualified, and particularly in general practice because it's so broad, it's a big step up, and I think it feels like a big, it's a big shift in responsibility. And I think what can happen sometimes, for example, I've certainly come across this, is relatively newly qualified GPs looking around at GPs 10, 20 years down the line or whatever, and actually comparing themselves, thinking, they know what they're doing, I don't know what I'm doing, or but of course that's not a light comparison, is it? And generally speaking, comparisons are not a helpful thing to do. But I think it's natural to have that self-doubt, but it's recognizing it for what it is, and actually working out how to move forwards with that, because we're always going to have self-doubt, is always going to play in our mind. But I think perhaps what I mentioned to you before is sometimes imposter thinking can sneak in a little bit as well.
I was just about to ask about that. Yeah. Would you say that this links in with imposter syndrome? Yeah, it
would. And I think it's funny that I use the term imposter syndrome, even though I'm not massively fond of that term in itself, because it sounds quite labeling, I think. I think it can also, sometimes organisations can hide behind imposter syndrome to almost shift the responsibility, for systemic issues onto the individual, and it can reflect a lack of diversity. But I guess what I'm talking about is it's more that imposter critic, so at the thinking level. So, the way I sometimes explain it to people, we've got our comfort zone where we do things which are routine to us and we're comfortable doing them, and it's a great place for rest and recuperation. But outside of that, we've got our stretch zone, and actually that's where our existing skills and abilities are stretched essentially, and that's where learning and growth happens. But kind of sitting on the periphery of the comfort zone in between the two is your inner critic or imposter critic, that voice of self-doubt, or sometimes people call it their gremlin or their mind monkey. But we've all got it, whatever you want to call it, we've all got it. And what it can do is it's very good at, in an imposter situation, at feeding you thoughts like, you're not good enough, you're a fraud, you're not the right person to be doing this job. Lots of unhelpful thoughts that, if you then believe them to be true, and I think this is where we can, make a difference. That results in feelings, which is often feelings of fear, which will be around, you fear being judged, or you fear that you're going to fail. And then, as a result from that, so your feelings lead on to your behaviour and how you show up. And so often it can certainly feed into perfectionism. So, because of that fear of failure, people just start working harder and harder and longer hours, and it can be quite overwhelming and exhausting. It can also feed into, stagnating in your job a bit, because actually you don't look for opportunities to potentially diversify your career or, for new roles, because that fear stops you from actually putting yourself out there in case it doesn't work out. There's always that, what if it doesn't work? And we're not so good at thinking, what if it does work? So I think that, that kind of thinking, that can happen throughout our careers. It's not just when we have job changes and things, but I think it can particularly kick in at times when you have kind of stepped up, and then it's recognizing it for what it is and managing it.
It sounds to me, and please do forgive me if I've misunderstood this. I mean, I'm far from a clinician myself, Sally, but what you've mentioned there about this imposter thinking, and that can lead you to try and almost overcompensating by doing extra work and working late, and maybe even taking admin home, and then that starts to influence your family life and so on. Do you think it can be things like the imposter thinking that is almost the catalyst that can lead to things like burnout for GPs?
I definitely think it can contribute because of that, that cycle that you get into of working harder and harder, and you just get more and more exhausted from it, and it can be quite overwhelming. I think that could definitely kind of lead into burnout, which again is why it's so worth being aware of it, because there was a time when I don't think I realised that kind of thing, stuff. I didn't realise that it existed, to be honest with you. And now when I look back on my career, there were definitely times when actually that was what was going on, but I didn't recognise it for what it was. I didn't realise that lots of other people have exactly the same experience, and they certainly have those same kind of thoughts. I didn't know that, so therefore I didn't speak to anyone about it. And it's actually much harder to manage it when it's in your head. It's so much easier when you get it out and talk to somebody about it. And again, like I said at the beginning about not being alone, if you're questioning your career, I would say this to anyone who has those kind of thoughts: is you are absolutely not alone. But it's really helpful to talk to someone.
Absolutely, and I think that in part is probably likely to do with the fact that as time progresses, we talk more and more about mental health, and particularly for men as well. They're more encouraged to talk about their mental health now, and just health in general. But I suppose at many times in the past, even within the last decade and before that, there is probably still that sense of again, for want of a better word, really, a bit of a stigmatism around the sense of, I am a GP, I'm here to take care of people, I'm taking care of people, I'm fine. And you don't really talk about these things yourself and things like that. And like you say, burnout is probably something that has been around for decades, but it's kind of again, for want of a better expression, a buzzword at the minute, in that, it is out there. It's in regular conversation within primary care to a degree. I mean, a number of
Yeah,
GPs I speak with are leaving their jobs because they feel burnt out,
yeah, yeah,
and I would
yeah.
imagine it's something you've come across as well, Sally.
Yeah, absolutely. Because in terms of contributors to burnout, I mean, I think there's many different contributors, but certainly finding yourself in a career that maybe isn't the best fit for you, for whatever reason, be that the specialty or clinical medicine as a whole. You spend a lot of your time working, so that can definitely contribute to it. I think it's brilliant that there is much more of a narrative around it now, because I think it's so important that we're talking about it. And like you say, traditionally, I think there has been this, doctors are a bit superhuman. And so, that there hasn't been, when I think of my training and even training that doctors go through now, there isn't very much emphasis on actually looking after yourself and reaching
No.
out for support when you need it. And I would really, really love that to change, because at the end of the day, you can't be everything to everyone without you can't be everything to everyone full stop, but you need to be able to look after yourself, to look after others. So I think,
Yes.
again, doctors are perhaps not so good at recognizing actually just to look after themselves, because why wouldn't you? Sometimes framing it in terms of actually everyone benefits if you look after yourself, if that helps them get on board with the idea,
Absolutely.
because everyone does benefit. It's not just themselves. That in itself is a good enough reason to be doing it. But
Yeah.
actually, your colleagues benefit, your patients benefit, your loved ones benefit. I do think that and I think it is increasingly getting out there. There needs to be more narrative around it. It's so hugely important to look after yourself as a doctor.
Absolutely. Just excuse me one moment. I just need to plug my laptop in because otherwise the battery's going to die. My apologies. Yeah, just going off what you've mentioned there, though, again, Sally, I think it's a case of that if you look after yourself, you're in a better position both physically and mentally to then deliver better levels of care to your patients, who they're your charge at the end of the day. That's what you get into, or what most people will get into medicine for, because they have that desire to take care of people and look after them and help make the population healthier. But I do think it's very easy to not talk about these things. And
Mm,
as I say, I think there's you may have come across this yourself with people that you've dealt with, but I think that the population are very quick to criticize doctors. They're not working long enough, or I didn't have a long enough consultation. They'll find every reason to
mm,
to discredit them and to complain, but they're very rarely given positive feedback.
yeah,
And I think that's probably something that leads to a sense of unhappiness in the role, because they don't feel as though, all the effort they've gone through to
yeah,
train and learn, they get to this position, and then, they might have a nice experience with a patient, don't
yeah,
ever hear anything of it again. And then you have one patient who decides to leave a Google review or ring the practice and
yeah.
complain. It could be anything. And I don't think there's that sense of understanding that these GPs are human beings as well.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
is that something you've found?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, completely. It's certainly something I think it reflects where society's at as a whole, if I'm honest with you, that we're quite quick to complain about things, but we're not so
Yeah.
good to give positive feedback. So I guess it's an extension of that. I think it can feel hard because you are giving your absolute all, and often
Mm.
it feels like you're not getting. When I say you're not getting much back, you don't go into it to get things back from it, but it is lovely, of course, and it's very motivating to get positive feedback.
Absolutely.
And I think it doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. But for example, not long ago, someone that I know locally just I just saw her, hadn't seen her for a while, and for some reason she mentioned, and this had happened about 5 years ago, an occasion that I'd come across her in the hospital. She'd been visiting a relative. I recall that she was upset, and she started telling me how much that had meant to her when she'd met me in the corridor, but at the time she was too emotionally, she was distressed, so she couldn't articulate it at the time. But sometimes I think I have to, certainly when I was working clinically, I had to remind myself that there is a lot of that sense of being valued that isn't expressed. It is there. It's a bit like actually when you leave a job, that's another thing I've found, that you'll suddenly get letters from patients that know you, who are giving that positive feedback, but just don't on a day to day. And but it is demoralizing because certainly within the media, I think, there is a lot of negativity around it, and when you see the other side of that, it's really quite hard to listen to some of the media reports. It's
that sense of, bad news sells in the media. And I think, whether it's a panorama investigation or you get, different articles and saying, GPs are they're working remotely and they're not available for face-to-face and things like that. But I don't think there's a proper understanding of it. And then you get the headline things, saying GP waiting list off the scale or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
There's this instant, and you mentioned this yourself in terms of kind of what society's like. There's this instant sense of, oh, well, that's not good enough. Let's be negative about this. And there's a lack of attempt to understand this.
Yeah.
And then, the GPs get a bad rep because they're the most commonly known position within primary care. And it's this vicious cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which isn't right at all. And it isn't fair on GPs because, as I say, it leads to them having a lot of grief, and unfortunately something that leads to unhappiness, which then eventually becomes them wanting to leave the profession.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think there's any recognition of the link between the two, is there, by the general public, arguably, on many occasions. Actually, it's like with any profession, isn't it? There's only so much berating you can do until they up and leave, because why would you stay if actually that's the negativity surrounding a very important job that you're doing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I have to bite my lip quite frequently.
I can imagine though, and it's frustrating when we have, both myself and a multitude of colleagues, we can have a conversation with a GP, and they can talk to us about what the day-to-day is like. And I mean, I spoke to a GP yesterday, in fact, and she's seeing 20 patients per session. At the moment, she's expected to deal with 40 patients in a day, and she's just had her head down and she's grafting and she's working hard. But she said to me, "Look, I feel guilty for wanting to leave and find a better job. She's commuting 45 minutes each way. She's dealing with 40 patients a day. Some of them are, naturally very unappreciative and can be rude and things like that. And I just don't think there's enough appreciation for GPs, regardless of how many patients they're seeing in a session. It's still a tough job, even if you're only seeing 5, 10, 15 patients in a session.
I totally agree with you. It's a hugely tough job. It's such a tough job. It's so broad. There's such a lot of responsibility. It is huge. And actually, coming back to, you mentioned there about the guilt, that's another thing that I would say is something that comes across all the time, is that, when you're starting to question whether or not you actually want to stay within clinical medicine because the cost is becoming too high on an individual level. But then as a double whammy, the guilt kicks in as well. And it's that guilt of, I should be doing this. I should be working as a doctor. And again, I think that can stop people. And it's quite hard on your own to work through that. But it's really, I'm glad you raised it, actually. It's really common that, those feelings of guilt. And the other thing is sometimes people feel that they're failing because they don't want to carry on in their career. And again, there's carrying on when you've got all those feelings and not actually having the opportunity to work out actually where do you want to go with that is quite debilitating.
Yeah, I think it's that sense as well of with almost, as I say, that sense of guilt. The practices themselves can sometimes add to that, by saying, oh, if you leave, you're letting the patients down and things like that. But sometimes it's the practices that need to change, and they should feel guilty for overworking their GPs. But then it can come down to factors like they might be thinking about numbers and finances and QOF scores and whatever it may be. The GPs themselves are not properly taken care of, and even other professions, nursing and allied health professionals as well.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think you can get into a bit of a vicious cycle where actually you've got a whole load of people who are kind of operating in their stress zone, and actually that it impacts across. I think what you have to do as an individual is think about, what do I need? What do I need to thrive? And actually it may be that actually you can't stay within that practice. Well, if that is the wrong practice for you and it is impacting your mental well-being, then something's got to change.
Yes.
That is what I would definitely say, is don't stay stuck with something that is impacting you and costing you your mental well-being, and seek help sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
Because I think the other thing doctors certainly do, and in fact probably healthcare professionals as a whole, is you kind of you're on a downhill trajectory, and there's a temptation to think, well, I'll just wait. It's not that bad. It's not that bad. I'll just wait until I hit rock bottom. That you don't obviously articulate that in your head, but I think that's kind of what
Yeah.
goes on. It's so much easier to get help when you realise that things are slipping down, rather than to wait until you're rock bottom.
Absolutely. And in the podcast that I recorded with the lovely Dr. Clara Doran, when we discussed burnout specifically, she mentioned to me that you get to a point as you're heading toward burnout where it's too late. It's going to happen. You can't necessarily. Well, there's still things you can do, but you are getting to that point. Whereas, as you've mentioned yourself, Sally, if you act on it straight away, something can be done. But it's also comes down to the sense of practices need to have a rethink and rejig things, because they need to appreciate that in certain circumstances they are putting too much pressure on the team. I've spoken with a practice just recently, in fact, in Haywards Heath, that they've recently increased all GP appointments to 15 minutes, whether it's over the phone or in person, instead of it all being 10 minutes. That's made a big difference. They're bringing in extra admin staff to take away the admin responsibilities from the GP, so they can focus on the clinical one-to-one, that side of things. So things can be done. But again, I think if things aren't done, then GPs are put in this position where they are made to feel a little bit guilty if they even think about going elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually the other thing I would say is to articulate what you want. If you're working within a practice, I think there's a temptation to think, oh, they're not going to go for that. This is very much the thing. Actually, I always remember my mum saying when I was younger, well, if you don't ask, you don't get. What have you got to lose by asking? And it may well be that they're like, no, that doesn't fit in with whatever. But actually, bearing in mind that there are, it's difficult retaining doctors at the moment. If there is something that you think is going to make a difference to whether or not you stay within that practice or look elsewhere or whatever, what have you got to lose by asking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us to things as well, just going back to what you mentioned earlier about how it can be so individual and circumstances are different. I speak to more and more GPs now who might be asking for a term time contract, or if they can base it around the kids' schooling, or even if it's things like, can I leave at 2:30, do the school run, and then make some calls from home? And thankfully there are practices that are becoming more open to something like that. But then you still get those as well that say, no, you have to be here 8 to 6:30. You only get X amount of time for your lunch break. You've got to do your home visits over your lunch break as well. And there's still too much pressure there. But I think there's this sense of, you're a GP, you should be able to handle it, from some practices. They don't actually appreciate that, again, that GPs are human beings, and it's not an easy job.
It's really not an easy job, and we all do it differently, and we've all got different styles of doing it, and that's brilliant, because it would be very boring if we did everything the same. It really would. But I think one of the tools that I use actually when I'm working with people around their career is something called a DISC. It's a personal assessment tool, and it looks at different styles of behaviour. Because actually human behaviour within limits is actually fairly predictable. So, people tend to, it tends to affect how people communicate, or how they organise their lives, how they prioritise. And actually knowing where you sit within that framework is quite useful. In fact, it's very useful, because and we can all dial up and dial down behaviours. That's the great thing about it. But we will all have a natural go-to tendency, which is the style that for us is the least effortful. It's the least energy consuming. But what you find when you do this is that actually sometimes the way people feel they have to flex their style to be successful in their work environment, if they are significantly having to flex away from their natural style constantly, that's actually quite exhausting. And again, that's something that, flags up sometimes when you see that and just think, Not necessarily, but often it is. And particularly when you're working in a very hard job like general practice, if you are constantly having to flex your style, that in itself is just really quite tiring.
Yeah, it takes you away from being the sort of clinician you want to be as well, I suppose, does it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a common example I come across is, one of the ways that we're all different is, some people tend to prefer a faster pace, which will often correlate with being more outgoing. Some people tend to prefer a slower pace, which will correlate with being more reserved. And actually, the more reserved, the time pressures in general practice are immense regardless. But actually, if you are somebody who your natural tendency is to prefer to just take a bit more time, time to make a plan, come up with work out what you're going to do, be a bit more holistic, take other factors into consideration. It's really quite hard to maintain that in the 10-minute slots that are back to back. So again, it's when you look at that, it often helps people recognise maybe where there's a bit of a disconnect going on.
Okay. Yeah, it's fascinating, and I think it is a point that is very relevant up and down the UK, regardless of whether it's a newly qualified GP, an experienced GP. I think this is something that any of our listeners would find very very interesting. A point that I'd like to touch on as well, Sally, is something that we discussed beforehand, is the potential for career diversification. What could you tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that comes up, not infrequently with GPs. And I think, portfolio careers have been, they've been around for a while. And I think increasingly, increasingly being used as a, form of career diversification. And I would caveat it to say it's not for everybody. But actually, they do potentially bring quite a lot of advantages. And when I say portfolio careers, so for some people that might be, it's about essentially how working your working week within more than one role. So often people will have a primary medical role, so their GP work, but then they will have, other time during the week where they are, working in another area of interest. So that might be something still within the medical world. So it might be, teaching or, medical education, or maybe something health tech related, something allied. Or sometimes it can be something kind of totally outside of medicine, like someone I know who's works part-time as a yoga teacher. So it can be what you make of it. But I think one of the things I find with the doctors I work is that one of the things it can feel like it's lacking when they're just working within general practice is that sense of autonomy. And I think that's what kind of portfolio careers can potentially increase your sense of autonomy, because you're working your working week based on, what you have chosen to do with it, which is really quite useful. I think it can give you that sense of freedom as well. It highlights the fact that actually you don't just have to rely on, clinical medicine, GP. Your eggs are not all in one basket, if you see what I mean. And I think that in itself is quite freeing. And often what seems to happen is that people then actually enjoy their primary medical role more than they did when they were just doing it more intensely. So I think it's a good way to, explore other avenues and potentially increase your enjoyment. The other thing actually that does come up a lot with doctors, it's something they feel is lacking, is creativity, or a way to use their creative side.
Okay.
And which again, I hadn't realised how common this would be, but it does come up a lot that, creativity is very broad, isn't it? There's so many different ways that you can be creative. And often doctors just feel that that's lacking in their day-to-day kind of clinical work. And so developing a portfolio career does allow you to potentially pursue that side of things. And alongside, variety, some people love variety. Again, not everyone, but lots of people do. And it can just give you a bit more balance across your week as well, in terms of, as we've said, those days in general practice are really quite intense. They can be quite stressful. It can give you a bit of a stress buffer in a way, because you're having some of your working week is not in quite such an intense environment. So I think there's lots of advantages.
Yeah, and I know it comes back to the old saying of variety is the spice of life, but I think it applies to GPs as well.
Yeah.
Because even within general practice, I appreciate that some GPs like to go on and specialise and do certain things, but what tends to be the case now, from my experience from speaking to GPs and practices, is that very often GPs in this generalization of a clinical professional,
Yeah.
we'll end up seeing purely more kind of the more the word escapes me now, but the more serious things, the things that
Yes.
might be
Yeah.
more complex, that's the word.
Yeah. Yeah.
The more complex cases,
Yeah.
and then physicians like your ANPs, your paramedic practitioners, physician associates, they might be past the more routine, let's say
Yeah.
ear, nose, throat, coughs, colds, things like that. So even within this role that is designed to be a general practitioner, it becomes
Yeah.
quite specific because I appreciate, there's a variety of complex cases, but they end up dealing with almost
Yeah.
purely complex appointments,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
they lose that variety again.
Yeah, I think you lose that variety, and actually the intensity of the work you're doing also increases at the same time, because constantly dealing with complex cases, if you're back to back dealing with them, and often potentially supporting, allied health professionals in terms of, supervising them and what they're doing,
Mm.
it's really quite intense, isn't it? And I think that is why, it feels that it's even harder in general practice now than it used to be, because of the complexity of the cases that you're managing, and the fact that you're not getting a sneaky little sore throat in the middle or whatever. There's no catch up potential. It is that complexity, I think, is really significant, which again is why that more portfolio approach can be helpful, because you're not having that intensity across your entire week.
Yes.
So I think I certainly think it's something worth exploring. As I said, it's not for everyone.
No.
I think obviously you have to factor in, the financial security, stability side of things, and I think you have to be quite careful in terms of, if you're already feeling a little bit overwhelmed, what you don't want to do is increase your overwhelm.
Yeah.
So you need to be a bit careful, and you need to be quite clear on, boundary setting as well, kind of in terms of the different roles. But as I say, for some doctors it works well, and I think, like you alluded to, I think there is that variety that you mentioned. You particularly perhaps when you've been in role for a while, actually you just get stuck in a bit of a rut, and you're just, as well as it being quite intense and quite stressful, you can actually reach a point of where you feel like you're not learning anymore. So I guess, like I said, you're back in your comfort zone, and actually just kind of moving out a bit into your stretch zone and learning something new, that keeps you engaged and it keeps you motivated. So I think it can be quite helpful if often people talk about a bit of a mid-career slump. That's certainly well recognised, that you've been doing something for a while and you just no longer feel that you're developing or growing. So I think it can be useful in that situation as well.
Absolutely. Even if there is somebody who, for instance, might want to pursue a particular specialism, to a degree, there's only so much you can learn, and then you get to that point where you feel like you've been there, done that, got the t-shirt, and you want to try and diversify and go into something else, and have this balance of the initial specialist interest and anything new. But I agree completely. I think that there is portfolio GP work is from conversations I've had, it sounds very fulfilling for a number of individuals. Like you said, it's not for everyone, and sometimes it will never be quite right for certain people. But for those people that it is right for, it seems to bring about that sense of happiness, which I think is the what's is key, and is what this podcast is about. We want GPs to be happy and feel fulfilled within their roles, and if a portfolio career does that for somebody, fantastic. But as you said yourself, Sally, so rightly, it's just not for everybody.
It's not, and I think it's and that's why it's potentially worth exploring as an option. It's an option, because, like you say, I think for some people it brings the enjoyment back, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? So it's worth exploring, and just bearing in mind we're all individuals, and as I say, what's right for your colleague may not be right for you, and vice versa. Hence always worth coming back to the individual and what is right for you at this point in time, in the context of everything else going on in your life.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, I think that covers everything that we were wanting to have a chat about today, Sally. Before we wrap things up, though, is there anywhere that any of our listeners could potentially, I know we've mentioned LinkedIn, but can they connect with you or get in touch with you if they feel that they'd be interested in having a chat?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn. As I say, my website is www.sallyhambly.co.uk. And my email contact address is just info@sallyhambly.co.uk.
Wonderful. If any of our listeners are wanting to get in touch with Sally, you'll be able to do so. We'll put a link to Sally's website and to her LinkedIn profile when we post this podcast online. Sally, thank you very, very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure having a conversation with you and going through that information. You'll be able to listen to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube as well, and all the other kind of usual podcast locations. Thank you again for your time, Sally. It's been really lovely to speak with you.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely to speak to you too.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.